Welcome to the Voice of the Beginning, the Word of the Bible. Before we begin, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with those you love.
The atmosphere within the halls of Babylon is not merely one of celebration, but of a dense and intoxicating blindness that consumes the very souls of those present. The air is thick with the scent of costly incense, fermented wines, and the sweat of 1,000 nobles, who believe themselves invincible behind walls that seem to touch the heavens. Belshazzar sits upon his throne, yet his spirit dwells in a desert of vanity where the only permitted voice is that of his own inflated ego. The central objective here is to reveal how the human heart, once disconnected from the source of life and divine light, desperately tries to fill the inner abyss with excess, noise, and lust. This feast is a grand performance of power that masks a profound spiritual misery. A banquet where one eats the bread of arrogance and drinks from the cup of perdition. The glint of gold under the flickering torches does not provide light. Instead, it blinds the spiritual vision, casting distorted shadows across the blue marble walls. In a final act of rebellion against the Creator, Belshazzar orders the golden and silver vessels that his father, Nebuchadnezzar, took from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought forth. By touching these objects, the king does not merely touch metal, he wounds sanctity itself and defies God to his face. 2. The spiritual tone is one of a vibrant warning. The profanation of the sacred, treating the divine as common, is the definitive first step toward the abyss. Every drunken laugh echoing through the corridors is a futile attempt to drown out the deafening silence of God, who watches the decay of that lineage from the heights above. The walls of Babylon, wide enough for chariots to race upon them, offer a false sense of security that imprisons hearts in the illusion of earthly immortality. While the sentries look outward, the enemy has already entered through the gate of the king's soul, for his spirit has fallen into ruin long before the first stone of the palace ever drops. The narrative must lead the viewer to feel the weight of this heavy atmosphere, where stolen gold shines with an eerie light, and the wine served in holy cups seems to sear the conscience of those who still harbor a shred of fear. This is the portrait of a humanity that, by styling itself as its own god, sets the stage for its own inevitable destruction, ignoring the fact that the hour of justice is already knocking at the door. The transition from euphoria to absolute terror occurs at the exact moment the veil between the visible and invisible worlds is torn without warning or clamor. There are no thunderclaps to announce the arrival of justice, nor the sound of trumpets to warn of a divine invasion. There is only the smooth, slow, and deeply terrifying movement of fingers of pure light emerging from nothingness, etching into the plaster of the wall across from the main lampstand. This chapter focuses intensely on the reaction of the human soul when it is suddenly stripped of all its masks before the manifestation of absolute holiness. King Belshazzar, who moments before felt like a god above all laws and all men, now experiences the collapse of his own physical and spiritual structure as his knees knock against each other, and his face pales to the shade of ashes. The central spiritual message of this moment is the inescapable truth that absolutely no one, no matter how powerful their throne, is hidden from the eyes of him who sees all and weighs all. The script describes a supernatural paralysis that spreads through the 1,000 guests like an invisible frost, cutting short the laughter and transforming shouts of joy into sighs of silent agony. It is the weight of the presence of God invading the hall, a spiritual density that makes the air difficult to breathe and turns the flavor of the most expensive wine into an unbearable bitterness of gall. The music, which was once the fuel for debauchery, now becomes a distant and dissonant echo of an imminent judgment that can no longer be avoided or delayed by human pleas. In this scene of awe, the ghostly hand does not write with ink, but with destiny itself, leaving marks that burn the retinas of those who watch and the consciences of those who ignore them. The contrast between the artificial glare of the torches and the light emanating from the celestial fingers reveals the fragility of Babylonian glory, showing that true authority does not reside in armies, but in the sovereign will that governs the cosmos. The fear consuming Belshazzar is not merely the fear of physical death, but the spiritual dread of a spirit that finds itself wanting before eternity, as the writing advances inch by inch, sealing the end of an era of impunity and beginning the time of final reckoning. Faced with the overwhelming mystery unfolding upon the wall, Belshazzar desperately turns to his magicians, astrologers, and diviners. Yet the limited human spirit, darkened by sin, does not possess the key to decipher the handwriting of the Creator. This chapter explores the profound and agonizing frustration of those who seek answers to the dilemmas of the soul through cold logic alone, through the science of men, or through worldly powers rooted in superstition and idolatry. A vacuum of understanding consumes the so-called wise men of Babylon, who once boasted of knowing the secrets of the stars, but who now stumble in their own ignorance before 4 words written by the hand of the Most High. This moment serves as a powerful spiritual metaphor for man's intrinsic inability to save himself or to find the path of truth through mere intellect or empty rituals that fail to touch the heart of God. The atmosphere in the hall transforms into a cauldron of confusion and fear, where the silence of the sages screams louder than any outcry, revealing that the wisdom of this world is foolishness before the Lord. The immeasurable wealth of the empire, the jewels adorning the necks of the nobles, and the treasures accumulated over generations suddenly prove useless and worthless in buying peace of mind, or an understanding of the fate already sealed on that white wall under the light of the lampstand. Belshazzar's despair deepens as he realizes that his gold cannot translate the divine will, and that his army cannot fight against a sentence issued from a kingdom that is not of this world. It is the collapse of intellectual pride, where the human mind reaches its extreme limit and is forced to admit that, without revelation from above, man walks in darkness even under the noonday sun. In this landscape of helplessness, the narrative highlights the contrast between the complexity of Babylonian rituals and the cutting simplicity of the divine truth waiting to be revealed. The so-called seers look at the letters and see only meaningless strokes, for their eyes are blinded by arrogance and by lives dedicated to gods who have mouths but do not speak. The chapter concludes with a sense of total desolation, preparing the viewer's spirit to understand that when human wisdom fails and despair becomes absolute, only one who possesses the spirit of the living God can bring the light necessary to pierce the darkness of judgment. It is the eternal lesson that truth is not discovered by the effort of the flesh, but granted by the grace of Him who holds control over all times and seasons. Into this scene of chaos emerges the figure of Daniel, not as a common diviner seeking royal favors, but as a crystalline channel of integrity and an unshakable connection to the Most High. At the very moment dread paralyzes every heart, the Queen Mother appears to recall a prophet forgotten in the corridors of time. Describing Daniel as one who possesses an excellent spirit, gifted with the light of divine knowledge and an intelligence that transcends natural ability. This chapter focuses intensely on spiritual authority that is not born of human titles or lineages, but is forged in the fire of constant communion with the living God. While the palace of Babylon trembles under the weight of its own iniquity, and the wise men stumble over their sumptuous robes, Daniel remains as firm as a rock in the midst of a surging ocean, demonstrating that true security lies not in armies, but in the purity of a life dedicated to holiness. The narrative emphasizes that in the moment of final crisis, when all the lights of the world go out and fleshly pleasures lose their luster, the world will always desperately seek those who have not allowed themselves to be corrupted by the king as delicacies and who have not bowed before the golden idols of the prevailing culture. It is the definitive encounter between eternal truth and fleeting illusion. A clash of realities where Daniel Eddy's mere presence brings with it a weight of reality so overwhelming that it makes the entire luxurious banquet seem like nothing more than a fading shadow before the morning light. He enters the hall not to be applauded or to receive the promised golden chains, but to be the voice of a court that accepts no bribes, carrying in his eyes the serenity of one who has already seen the glory of God and therefore is not intimidated by the false brilliance of earthly courts. The spiritual contrast is absolute, for Daniel represents the man who overcame the world through spiritual discipline and the fear of the Lord, while Belshazzar represents the man who was overcome by his own appetites. The prophet's presence acts as a mirror reflecting the empire's decadence, proving that knowledge of God's mysteries is reserved for the pure in heart, and not for those who flaunt crowns of pride. The script must emphasize that Daniel's authority does not come from the fear he imposes, but from the peace he exudes, a peace that is offensive to the wicked and liberating to those who seek justice. It is the climax of human dignity restored by the divine, where the servant of God becomes the only master in a room full of lords enslaved by panic, preparing the ground for the voice of the eternal to finally echo through purified human lips. Daniel does not limit himself to being a mere translator of archaic symbols. He stands as the spokesman delivering the final verdict from the courtroom of heaven. This chapter details the profound meaning of many tekel and parsin through a spiritual lens that spans the centuries, revealing that the life of every human being is at every moment being counted, weighed, and lamentably often found wanting before eternal justice. The tone here is one of maximum introspection, a silent yet urgent invitation for every viewer to look at their own internal scale and question what would remain of their existence if it were measured by the yardstick of absolute holiness. Daniel is not seduced by the offers of gold or power made by King Belshazzar, for he knows that one cannot negotiate with divine truth once the time of grace has run out. The prophet recalls with both severity and compassion the fate of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar's predecessor, remembering how the former monarch was humbled to the very dust so that he might understand that the Most High holds dominion over the kingdoms of men. The narrative emphasizes that humility is the only real protection against a fall, as it is the soil where wisdom flourishes, while pride is but a pedestal of sand that crumbles under the weight of the first storm. The spiritual message is sharp and clear. The power Belshazzar flaunted as if it were his by right was in truth a sacred loan from God, a talent that should have been used for justice and for good, but which the king in his foolishness returned empty and stained by arrogance. The sentence now glowing upon the wall is not an arbitrary punishment from a vengeful deity, but the natural and inevitable result of a heart that systematically closed itself to the light until darkness became its only dwelling place. Daniel pronounces the words with the weight of eternity, explaining that many means God has numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to a set end, for nothing lasts forever outside the divine will. In explaining tekel, Daniel strikes the very core of the king's conscience, by declaring that he has been weighed in the balances and found wanting, revealing the superficiality of a life lived only for pleasure and self-glorification. Finally, by revealing the meaning of parsin, the prophet announces the division and surrender of the empire to the Medes and Persians, symbolizing the dissolution of everything built upon the foundation of sin. The atmosphere in the hall reaches an unbearable level of tension, where the silence following Daniel's words is heavier than the noise of 1,000 armies. The script must convey the idea that divine judgment is, above all, a restoration of the moral order of the universe, where truth finally prevails over lies and justice reclaims its rightful place, making it clear that before God there are no kings or subjects, but only souls who will be measured by the sincerity of their faith and the righteousness of their deeds. As the words of judgment, spoken by Daniel, still echo through the cedar beams of the great hall, the physical reality of the empire begins to align relentlessly with the spiritual sentence decreed from on high. The Persian army, acting as a providential instrument of divine justice, works in the darkness to divert the waters of the great Euphrates River, and that which for centuries seemed impenetrable and eternal in the eyes of men suddenly becomes vulnerable and exposed. This chapter illustrates with a melancholy depth the extreme fragility of all human constructs when the divine mandate is withdrawn and protection from above vanishes. The narrative flows with a rhythm of growing tension, contrasting the absolute terror consuming the guests in the hall with the silent and choreographed advance of the invaders walking along the dry and muddy riverbed, passing through the very gates that the Babylonians believed were their guarantee of immortality. Spiritually, this moment represents the point of no return, The instant when the opportunity for repentance definitively closes, and the consequences of past choices materialize into an inescapable reality. It is the demonstration that Babylon falls from within long before it falls from without. For a structure lacking spiritual integrity is merely an empty shell awaiting the breath of destruction. The script must emphasize that security based on gold and stone is a dangerous mirage, proving that the true kingdom is established in the spirit in righteousness and in communion with the eternal, and not in the strength of brick or the density of bitumen. The sound of the waters receding outside the walls is the echo of God's timing being fulfilled, a reminder that even the rivers and the tides obey the command of him who removes kings and establishes kingdoms according to his sovereign purpose. Inside the palace, the torches begin to flicker, as if sensing the proximity of the end, while the footsteps of the Persian soldiers, marching where the life of the river once flowed, symbolize the march of destiny that cannot be slowed by armies of flesh. The fall of Babylon is presented not merely as a military defeat, but as a cosmic collapse of a system that forgot its own finitude. The narrative must capture the final sigh of an era of pride where Belshazzar's luxury is confronted by the coldness of invading steel, revealing that all glory that does not glorify God is destined to be buried by the dust of time. This chapter serves as a solemn warning about the speed with which ruin reaches those who build their palaces upon a contempt for the sacred, showing that judgment, when it arrives, finds its way even through the most invisible cracks of the soul and of history. The final chapter concludes this journey with a powerful and solemn reflection on the absolute sovereignty of God over history, time, and every single breath of human existence. The death of Belshazzar, occurring on that very night of feasting and profanation, should not be viewed merely as the biological fall of a monarch or the end of a dynasty, but rather as the definitive closure of an era of explicit rebellion against the principles of the Most High. This outcome reveals that divine patience, though immense, has a limit established by his own justice, and that the time of men is but a brief interval within the schedule of eternity. The script closes with an urgent and necessary call to spiritual vigilance, reinforcing the idea that the same hand that wrote upon the wall of Babylon still observes nations' governments and individual hearts today, acting invisibly yet constantly upon the scales of universal morality. The permanent spiritual lesson this episode leaves us is that all the glory of this world, with its marble monuments and accumulated treasures, is intrinsically fleeting and subject to the erosion of time, while the word of God remains unshakable forever. The narrative must guide the viewer to understand that empires change names and walls change locations, but the eyes of him who probes the deepest intentions continue to seek integrity and humility. The video ends with the striking image of the wall now empty, where the rising light of dawn illuminates only the cold plaster, and the silence of a palace that no longer belongs to its former owner, yet with the echo of Daniel's message engraved indelibly upon the collective memory of humanity. This closing seeks to leave a mark of reverence upon the soul of the viewer, reminding us that we are all, without exception, weighed daily in the balances of eternity, and that our true heritage lies not in what we build with our hands, but in what we allow God to write in our lives. The final scene should evoke a sense of hope for those who seek the light, and a sacred awe for those who walk in arrogance, sealing the script with the certainty that history is not a chaos of accidents, but a tapestry carefully governed by a hand that, though ghostly to those without faith, is the only hand capable of sustaining the destiny of the entire universe. Thus, Belshazzar's feast becomes a mirror for posterity, a reminder that the end of all things is at hand, and that true wisdom consists in living, so that when we are weighed, we are not found wanting.
May this word take root in your spirit and guide your steps. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.